Hi guys, and welcome back to Pass the Move. And for today's episode in the Premier League series, we've got Watford, the 18th team in the table, just alphabetically. So if any one of these teams are the teams that you're looking for, we definitely have that already covered in the guide, in the same playlist. And of course, if West Brom or West Ham is one of your teams, then we'll be covering that in the next few days as well. But for today, it's Watford. London-based squad team, really, and they're very interesting to take on for your, if you're looking for a challenge, then Watford are definitely one of those squads. We can have a quick look at, why you should take over Watford and that sort of business. But first, it says tactics and team guide. So just like the title, really what we'll be covering is obviously the tactics. Maybe what the best formation to use, the best instructions, how to bring out the best out of your squad overall. That's what the team guide comes into as well. Maybe players that you should sell, players that you should try and keep and build around, areas in your squad that might need some investment, just that type of things, just general tips. And obviously we'll cover these some of these tabs as well here on the left. But first, Watford and their history. So they're a very interesting team to take over. Just been promoted to Premier League recently in 2014-15 is when they won promotion, and they had their first season in the 2015-16 season where they finished 13th, which is really good for a newly promoted side. But the next season, which is last season, they finished in 17th, just above the relegation zone. So you kind of want to build on that. You want to try and get away from the relegation zone a little further. Every time you've been up, you've dropped straight away, other than this time, this point here. So you do want to try and stay as much as possible and try and build even further. In terms of their history, they've only won the Sky Bet League 1 twice, Sky Bet League 2 once, and the English Southern Premier Division as well, and that's kind of it. So you do want to have a consistent Premier League stay. There's a lot of trophies to be won and history to be built with in terms of Watford. Obviously Premier League, but also League Cups and FA Cups are very, Community Shields, even just any trophies to fill up this cabinet here, and that's what makes them so interesting. At the same time, of course, taking over Watford, you want to try and build on the team, build on their previous positions, but perhaps even more importantly, the competition expectations for Premier League is actually mid-table. So it's a bit tough to do. I'll explain why in just a moment. We'll have a look at the squad. But if you ask me, this squad is made for avoiding relegation battle. Maybe, I think mid-table is a bit of a reach. You'll finish just below. But I think if you do get around 13th like you did in your first season, that would be really good. But really, you're just kind of trying to avoid a relegation as much as possible. So you have a squad that's not built to meet the board expectations. It's something that you have to deal with, and it's what makes the challenge even more interesting. In terms of season preview, though, they expect you to finish 14th, and I think you do have a stronger squad, to be fair, than Huddersfield, Burnley, Brighton, these teams that we've covered before. So you should end above these squads. 14th seems a bit realistic, but anywhere here mid-table-ish where they're expecting, I think that's a bit of a stretch. Some of these squads do have better squads than you. One of the first things I like to do is obviously sort out my staff, but we'll be working with what we've got today, and I just like to try and see which coaching staff of mine I can trust in terms of their judgment of ability. So potentials, obviously judgment of potential is very important, but I'm just trying to figure out who's good right now out of my players. And it looks like goalkeeping coach Hugo Oliveira and Pedro Sosa here, my assistant manager, seem to be the best. I'm going to trust my assistant manager because obviously he's my assistant manager, but at the same time because his judging potential is higher than our goalkeeping coach as well, so it just makes a little bit more sense. The next thing is actually to head down to the under 23s. I like to include the under 18s as well and see if there's anyone who shouldn't really be down here. So in terms of ability, so Isaac's Success, I think he's actually already had a number of appearances for Watford, but he's just a championship player so far, so I'm not going to promote him, not ready for the first team. It has to be Premier League ability for me to actually include him in the squad. The same can be said about Tommy Hoban there and Daniel Buckman as well. So it looks like you don't necessarily have any youngsters ready for first team action just yet. The next thing to do is actually sort it out by age and see if there's anyone over 23 who you can move to the first team squad. Tommy Hoban's probably someone to keep an eye on because he's 23. Not sure if he'll be able to play for the under 23 squad. But yeah, it's just someone to keep an eye on. He's close to first team action as well. Maybe you could just loan him out and that'll save you some trouble as well. So I promoted some people, by the way, so there are some overage people, not any youngsters ready for first team action. So we'll talk about that in just a second. And this is your squad overall. So just looking at the general squad, in terms of the best positions, well, according to my assistant manager, you can have a look at ability as well. You can sort it out by ability, but I like to go through each player one by one to really try and find out their true judgment of ability, that sort of business. But just in general, I like to have a squad of 22 players, so it's good to see that you've got 26. At least you have the numbers. The question is, do you have the numbers in the right areas? And 26 people is great because you've got 4 over, which means you've got 4 people that you can definitely sell. I always have this policy of where you should buy first, then sell, so that you ensure you have your numbers. But if you've got 26, that means you're already 4 over. You can sell those without any sort of regret, I suppose. The reason why I like to buy first then sell is because sometimes people like to sell off players. Let's say, for example, we're going to sell Jose Holebas here. And we sell him off, and we know who we're going to buy. We try and go in for him once we have the money, and suddenly he's changed his mind. He's asking for huge wages that you can't afford, that sort of business, and suddenly you're just short of numbers. And at the same time, the money that you got for Holebas, if you sell him it says his value is for 4 million. You might sell him for 4 million, but the board only gives you 2 million available. So the money that you were relying on from Jose is not there, and again, you're just short of numbers. So it makes a lot more sense to buy first, then sell, and that way you're a lot safer. So we'll keep those things in mind: 22 players, and buying first and then selling. And another thing to keep in mind is the balance of your squad. So generally you should have 2 players per position, which is why I like to have a squad of 22s, 11 squad size players, I suppose. And the way I like to have it balanced is my starting 11 should be leading star or world-class players, and my backup 11 should be youngsters who have potential to become leading star and world-class players, but who are already ready for the Premier League in terms of their ability. And I feel like that balance makes the most sense. The youngsters aren't too, they're not going to complain too much about not too much game time, and they'll also be trying to fight for the first team squad, first team spot, and the starting 11 players who you should rely on mostly for your whole season, they'll be on their toes because they know there's some hungry youngsters behind them trying to get their spot. So that's the perfect balance to have. Obviously a lot of squads don't actually have that set up for you, something you have to build eventually. So the tips that I suggest today will actually just be more of a long-term thing, not something that you can necessarily do in one season. If you can, that's incredible. But the truth is, just like in real life, you generally only will be able to sell or buy about 3 players per transfer window. Anything more than that will not only upset the rhythm of your squad, but also be very difficult to do in one transfer window. It's not as easy as everyone thinks. But yeah, just think about these things as long-term goals to eventually get towards. So now that we know how many players we've got and what we're trying to go for in terms of the squad balance and whatnot, we can actually have a look at whether our best players, who our best players are. So we'll go in one by one. But having had a look at the squad, I've decided a 4-3-3 seems to make the most sense. We've got 3 strikers, so maybe playing a 2-striker formation doesn't make the best sense. At the same time, we have a ton of central midfielders and defensive midfielders. So again, we need to strengthen the middle of the park. And it kind of ties in with the tactic that we're playing. So I've tried to, put in as many of Watford's best players in the same 11, and at the same time try and make a tactic that would suit the team in comparison to the rest of the league, of course. So if you just sort it out by ability, you can find out your best 11 players. But having gone through the squad, each player one by one, I found that some of these players aren't necessarily the best. You do have a lot of squad depth in the middle of the park, but other than that, you are lacking in some areas. And so actually these are where these other players come in, and that's kind of it. So having looked through each player, I've realised that the main ability aim that you should aim for at the moment is just getting your squad up to a decent player Premier League ability first, and then you can obviously build on that and go into good or leading. If you find good in leading first that you can actually manage to bring in, obviously do that. But the minimum aim of having a decent player per position in your squad. You shouldn't have any championship players. If you do, you're more of a relegation candidate than you are a mid-table team, and so unfortunately that's what's happened with Watford. So we can actually just go into each player per each position, each player, and knowing now our formation, we can actually decide whether we got the right numbers and right quality in the correct areas. So 4-3-3, with a defensive midfielder. That means, each position. So we need 2 goalkeepers, and we do have the numbers at least, but the quality is a little lacking. So Gomez here is a decent player for most Premier League sides, so he is our starting goalkeeper. And it's good to see, but obviously you're better off investing in someone who's in better ability. But for now, starting 11 player, and your backup here, Orestes, is actually just a championship player. Now he's on loan, so I think you can actually, no, you can't terminate his loan. It says outside the transfer window. Are we not in the transfer window? What's going on? Either way, if you could cancel his loan, it might be a smart thing to do and bring in the backup youngster with potential who can eventually overtake Gomez. Or you have the alternative, since Gomez isn't the best, he's not a leading player, for example. You have the alternative of bringing in a good goalkeeper from most Premier League sides and demoting Gomez from first team football to a rotational option. Brazilian international though, and obviously tons of experience, 36 years of age, used to be at Tottenham for a while, as everyone knows. You signed him for free back in the Championship, so he is a smart and good enough player to be included in your first team. The problem is that you're trying to improve your ability, but at least you know that the squad depth in this area is lacking. So you could cancel this player's loan and bring in a good player from most Premier League sides, or it depends on obviously the players that you find and the finances that you have. You can bring in a youngster potential, but for now at least you have the numbers, and that's more important than actually having the quality. Quality comes second. You need options to rotate in case anyone gets injured. So right backs, it seems you've got 2, Brice and Daryl Janmaat. I don't think any of these centre backs here can play as right backs, and I don't think we necessarily would want them to. So we'll assume it's just these 2 until we go into any other position. But bearing that in mind, we don't actually have a good enough right back, and that's why I haven't actually selected the right back or left back positions. Both are lacking seriously, so it is a huge area of concern. The good thing is that you've got numbers there, so that's what matters, but you do not have the quality at all. So Brice is actually injured for 6 weeks to 9 weeks, so he'll be okay. Should be back in time for the Premier League, but he is just a championship player, and the same can be said about Daryl Janmaat, who I think they bought from Newcastle. Okay, it's been a while as well. And yeah, both these players are apparently not good enough according to our assistant manager. The good news is that it says that Janmaat is a consistent performer, and I feel like they would have some strengths. The problem is that they're just not good enough. See, he's an international for Ivory Coast, for example. Janmaat is probably international as well for Holland. But yeah, he's lacking positioning. Obviously, ability is not good enough. He's wanted, so you could possibly get rid of him. And Brice is injured, so he's not going anywhere anytime soon. But obviously, the issue is that you need at least a decent player for your... So right back position is definitely somewhere you need to invest in. And then you can sell off one of these players according to, who you might prefer. I feel like you might be better off keeping Brice here, 26 years of age. He's just about hitting his prime. He has better positioning. He seems more capable at defending than Janmaat there. He's 20k wages, and he's considered a backup. He's happy with rotational football, so it might make a little bit more sense than if you kept Janmaat and brought in someone else, for example. Then Janmaat would be complaining that he's not getting first team action. So let's just assume Janmaat is our first teamer, and looks like he edges it in terms of ability just about, so we'll include him in the right back spot, but really he shouldn't be a starting 11 player. And that brings us to your centre backs. So you've got a number of them, far too many. You've got 7 and you only really need 4. And in terms of the first team options, you've got Britus and Sebastian, and those 2 should be your starting 11 players. They are the best. They're both good, decent players for most Premier League sides. I don't think you have anyone good in your defence, but your backups, you do have some capable backups. There is some decent strength in depth. So Kabul, he's just a championship player, someone you should try to be looking, moving him on. Adrian's the same. I think really only you have one capable backup, and I think that is Christian, who's a decent player for most Premier League sides. The problem is, I did consider playing a 3-man formation, a 3 centre-back formation, sorry, but it just didn't seem to suit the rest of the team. And the good news is that he's expecting rotational football anyway, so he's not expecting too much game time, so he should be okay with that Belgian international there. Mola Ouag is another player on loan who you don't necessarily need. Looks like you can't just terminate his loan just now, but you should look to do it as soon as possible because he is just a championship player and you have excess number as well. You could use those wages somewhere else. So keep in that mind, you really just have 3 centre-backs that you can really use, but the good news is obviously that you've got other numbers, and you should definitely look to invest in a youngster with potential, or possibly once more, if you can afford it and if you can find someone willing to move, a good player for most Premier League sides. But just bear in mind, Kabul is injured for 2 to 3 months. The likelihood is you're not going to be able to sell him this transfer window. You'll have to sell him in January, and so that's something just to, you know, keep an eye on. And Adrian's already expected to leave. Christian here is injured 6 to 9 weeks, so you could possibly get rid of him. And this looks like Katkar actually wanted to keep anyway, so it's Wag that you want to try and cancel his loan. Now, where you seriously short in in terms of positions, it looks like you really need a left back. Holebas seems to be a winger by trade. Off the ball and marking, concentration, first touch are serious issues, and I'll consider him a winger more than I would consider him a left back. But it looks like you don't have any numbers in that position, so it might make a bit more sense to play him in left back. The same can be said about Marvin. So let's consider these 2 players your left backs rather than your wingers. And if you do consider that, then you do need some serious investment, because these 2 are just championship players at best, and also they are not very capable left backs at all. They have poor defending attributes. They're more of natural wingers. If we were playing wingers, I would love that. But at the same time, they're also just championship players, so you should try and move them on. But I think you can get about, by the looks of it, about 15 million by selling both of them. But obviously, like I said, buy first then sell later. But if you ask me who is the better player, let's have a look. According to my assistant manager, it's Jose. So we'll play him for our left back for now, but definitely it's another area. So your fullbacks need huge investment in terms of your starting 11. Your backup, though, will definitely need some improvement too, and you should just be looking into bringing in an actual capable left fullback. So that brings us to our central midfielders and defensive midfielders, of course. So we've got Ben Watson there to about Decore here, and we'll including Roberto Pereira. We try to squeeze in the best 3, and it seems like Capoue, Decore and Pereira are your best central midfield trio. You've got a lot of depth, so you do have 7, and you only need 6, 2 defensive midfielders and 4 central midfielders. So we'll just keep that in mind as we go through each position. But we can consider Capoue as 1 defensive midfielder, Decore and Pereira as central midfielders, and that leaves us with these other players to look at. So Ben Watson is just a championship player, someone that you should definitely try and move on. So that depth isn't necessarily too great. I think he was in the under 23s anyways, and he is listed. Tom Cleverley is a decent player for most Premier League sides. I think he's gunning for first team football as well, 50k wages. Unfortunately for him, he's just not good enough compared to the other players. Chalobah and Hughes are both good enough for the Premier League, and they are very good. These are the kind of players that we're looking to invest in, youngsters with potential. They can become leading Premier League players, and so they're the perfect candidates for backup football. The problem is that Chalobah is expecting key player football, and Will Hughes is expecting first team football. So a lot of your central midfielders are expecting football that they don't necessarily or should necessarily get. So bearing that in mind, it's just Watson. So we do have 6 players. I feel like though you have a slight issue in that you do have a deep line playmaker in Will Hughes as a defensive midfielder, so you can play as a backup to Capoue. Cleverley is a central midfielder. Chalobah can play as a defensive midfielder as well. So you have to pick one of these as a central midfielder and one of these as a defensive midfielder. But you do have all the players in the correct positions, and your first team starting 11 and your backup 11, in terms of your depth, are very strong in the central midfield area. If I could play more central midfielders, I'd love to, without getting rid of some of the other squad places, other positions or whatnot. But we're playing with a 4-3-3, so you will have to manage the football very carefully, but at the same time you can straight from the beginning let them know, these 3, that they are not good enough for first team football. But just go on transfer, squad status, and just set them all as rotational option. It looks like they haven't necessarily complained just yet, but they might later. But if you ask me, they will your players in their squad actually recognize other players being better than them, so they should understand that Capoue, Decore and Pereira are better players than themselves. So it brings us to our wingers. You've got Femenia here, Andre Carrillo and Richardson. By the looks of it, are your only your only wingers. So you're short in numbers here. You got 3, you need 4. You've got 2 right wingers, which is good to see. Andre Carrillo is actually a decent player for most Premier League sides, so he's a good loan option, but you do eventually want to strengthen that area to not rely on loanees. But your backup Kiko here is actually not good enough. He's just a championship player, so you should try and invest in a youngster with potential and who can. You also have another option, obviously, of just bringing in an actual decent Premier League player, right winger. Obviously, that's because, you know, Andre Carrillo, after his loan finishes, he'll be looking to move on. Obviously, I don't think he should be spending 17.82 million on a decent player from most Premier League sides. And obviously, his wages is a little bit happy for a team who are, you know, sort of seem a bit destined for just finishing above relegation. I don't think the relegation candidates, if you use your starting 11 players, you should be okay. You're only weak in 2 areas, really, and so you should be able to get away with, you know, not going for relegation. I feel like the other squads who are worse off than you, but it's a matter of trying to push your squad into a better direction. So that's your right wing, but left wing is a definite. Out of every single position we just mentioned right now, you do have the numbers. It's just left wing which is short, so you do have to consider. The first place that you need to invest in is actually a backup left winger. Richarlison is a youngster with potential, but he is a Premier League footballer, so he's good. He's going to be our first team starting 11 option, but you can definitely improve on him. I can't expect him. Okay, he is expecting first team football. But if you ask me, you can try and bring in a better player. If not, just bring in another youngster who will fight with Richarlison for the same starting 11 spot. You've got 3 strikers when you only really need 2. Troy Deeney, of course, is your first team option. That's without a doubt a good player for most Premier League sides. Him and I think Capoue are your only good player for most Premier League sides. I feel like everyone else is just decent. Was it Decore as well? No, Decore is decent. Who was it? Was it Capoue then? Yeah, Capoue. They're your only 2, so you really need to try and bring out the best out of them. We'll talk more about the tactics as well and how we try to play them to try and really just, you know, use them in their best position possible. Andre Gray is a very capable, decent Premier League player, very good backup to have. He apparently he's unlikely to improve. He is 26 years of age, to be fair. The problem is that he's on incredibly high wages. 70k is not good enough for a backup player, and you know, Watford have just bought him in for 12 million, so you can't get rid of him just yet. But if you ask me, not good enough to keep in your squad because his wages is too high, and you can easily bring in a youngster with potential with half those wages and still someone who can actually overtake Troy Deeney, because Andre Gray is just not on the same level just yet. Stefano, though, is definitely nowhere near either of them, and he's susceptible to injuries too. He's a championship player. He's just someone that you should sell off because he's excess numbers as well. Anyways, 11 million in the bank, hopefully, and that way you can use that money to actually bring in a backup winger. So overall, you've got strong numbers all around your squad. It's just the left wing position that's, you know, a bit of an area of concern because you do need a backup there. And then otherwise, it's just all about bringing up the level of your squad depth and hopefully your first team 11 as well, if you can actually find players who are willing to move into your first team. So keeping that in mind with the 4-3-3 formation that we're playing, we've actually gone with this tactic. So we've trying to play everyone in as much comfort as possible. The starting 11 average role suitability seems to be quite decent. You know, about 3/4 of the circle is just about as high as you're ever going to get it without upsetting the balance of your squad. And just generally what we're trying to do is actually play a possession type of football. So a lot of people think possession type of football means, you know, this tiki-taka type of stuff, but really it's not. Possession type of football is about not dribbling too much, not taking useless shots, and not crossing too often, because you want to try and work the ball into the box. So keeping those things in mind, there is an eventual tactic that you want to work towards, which we'll cover in just a second. But yeah, you don't take too much risk when you're playing possession football, and that's why we've gone with a counter mentality. And so possession football suits us because not only do we have strong strength in the middle of the park, 4-3-3, which means we should dominate this area quite often. We've got good defensive, cover as well in defensive midfielder, and at the same time we're playing with a low-risk strategy, low-risk mentality, and we should be able to, hit teams on the break at the same time and cover ourselves defensively. So I like to play on a structured team shape, and I like to not have too many team instructions. I feel like those things go hand in hand. My understanding of team shape, if you're playing on structured, that means you're letting each player play according to their role and just do their own thing. Whereas when you're playing with fluid, the whole team, you can literally see them attacking and defending together. And I think this is my understanding, that they rely a little bit more on understanding the tactic through the team instructions. So I feel like if you have a lot of team instructions, you should probably be going with fluid. If you don't like to have a lot like I do, then you should probably go on structured. It also helps obviously keep a better team shape when you're playing structured. So it's just, you know, methods of football, I suppose. And in terms of the actual team instructions, we've just got shorter passing, work ball into the box, and dribble less. Now, if you ask me, you can change the mentality to defensive if needed to try and keep possession even more. And obviously, if your favourites to lose, as it says, counter is a bit more expressive, I suppose, or a bit more attacking than the defensive mentality. But I just like to have it on counter rather. But you can easily start off with defensive and then go into counter when you're, you know, trying to chase a goal, for example, or if you're losing the game or anything like that. Another thing you can actually change is, instead of shorter passing, you can leave it on mixed and go on retain possession. But I'm not really too much of a fan of the retain possession instruction. I feel like it kind of forces your players into keeping the ball pointlessly, rather than shorter passing, which just happens to tell the players to, you know, not be nonsensical with their passing, and that's it. And we've actually had to add the work ball into the box and dribble less instructions because, unfortunately for us, our players aren't necessarily too suited to possession type football. So wingers cross too often, which is why we have to try and have work ball into the box. We've got wingers who also dribble a lot. We're not looking for players who dribble a lot. The advanced forward dribbles a lot as well, so that's why we had work ball into the box. But eventually I'll show you what the tactic you should be working towards and what the instructions you should have, and explain it in more depth. But for now, since Carrillo and Richardson are Premier League players, we're going with wingers for them, and it just seems to make sense to have fullbacks on attack overlapping them, just to complement them. And you've got a defensive centre-back in Prodl. He can play as a central defender overall, but I feel like he lacks a bit of the aggression of it, and maybe since he's a bit more comfortable with defensive centre-back, and it doesn't harm our tactics, we're just going to let him play there. Britos is a natural central defender. He's got the attributes for it as well, so he'll suit that side as well. Kapue is a deep line playmaker on defend. Not only will he protect our defense, but he's also suited to our tactic, and he should, you know, he doesn't shoot often, for example, and he should hold a position well, and also be a creative player for us deep there. We've got Pereira as an advanced playmaker on support, so he's naturally more in the attacking position. He'll still do the job quite well in central midfield. He's a natural in that position, and it's the same role. He's just more comfortable playing in attacking midfield, and that's kind of the only difference. He should do that role quite well. We've got Decore as a Mesla. I would love to actually have Pereira as a Mesla as well. I think if you feel like one of these players aren't performing too well, you can just shift them around, because even though Roberto Pereira is a little uncomfortable with a Mesla role, his attributes suggest that he could do that role quite well. He's just lacking in some areas like bravery, concentration, and fitness, but I have this rule of thumb where if they're short in just 3 attributes, you can get away with a role. In comparison, Decore, though, he's not necessarily short in anything other than finishing, but I feel like that's kind of a key instruction to have. Now with the Mesla, you should be able to, you know, the tactic should work on a support role, but if you feel like you're not being attacking enough, you can definitely switch him up into a Mesla on attack duty. It'll do the job just fine. Dini is most natural as a defensive forward on support. Unfortunately for him, the rest of the tactic doesn't suit him. You know, having him play as a defensive forward on support, we don't need him. You can actually play him as a target man. It gets the best out of him in terms of attributes, if you ask me, but obviously a target man means you're not retaining possession a lot. It suits the tactic, but at the same time, it means your players will probably, you know, lump the ball forward to him more often than they would to any other striker. If you do play a target man on support, then maybe you could change shorter passing into retain possession instead. But yeah, advanced forward, he's very capable. He's just a little uncomfortable with it, I suppose, but other than that, his attributes suit it quite well as well. And that's kind of it. I feel like we covered every single role. It looks like Gomez is better suited as a sweeper keeper, but we're not playing an offside trap, and I don't think I would trust him too much as a sweeper keeper on attack. So I'd rather him just play as a simple standard goalkeeper. Even then, he's lacking in some roles like kicking, decision making, and as a sweeper keeper, your decision making is even more key. And obviously, he's lacking in concentration as well, and his eccentricity, that tough word, also comes into play in that 16, which is a bit too high. I feel like I think with eccentricity, you actually want a goalkeeper who has low attribute of this. I think it's one of the attributes in the game where you actually want them to not have too much of it, because it just means that your goalkeeper is a bit more unpredictable than usual, and so you want to try and avoid that. You want a goalkeeper who's solid and not, you know, someone like Simon Mignolet, for example, might have high eccentricity, and that kind of explains that really. But yeah, In terms of what you eventually want to build towards, this is the tactic that you want to get to. A false nine suits this, the role itself explains it as well. It's more similar to advanced attacking midfielder or a playmaker role. Unconventional lone striker. I feel like it's the only striker role that actually explains that you can play solo. Trey Quartista dribbles too much for our liking. Defensive forward, I think a defensive forward might work eventually, but for us right now, it just doesn't seem to make sense with the rest of the tactics, I feel. But you could definitely go with defensive forward as well, just like the false nine, because it says that, he's a lone striker, and that's exactly what we've got. Complete forward on support is too risky, dribbles more and all that sort of business. A poacher doesn't necessarily suit the tactic, if you ask me. A target man on support, again, we already discussed. Advanced forward, you want to avoid. Deep lying forward could possibly do the job too, but again, it's just preference of a false nine. Seems to suit a possession style of football more than any other sort of role. The Rodemonteur on attack, Richardson. Rodemonteurs, they pass shorter, they don't cross, they get further forward, move into channels, run for position. They kind of are the perfect winger to have in a 4-3-3 possession type football. And at the same time, you want an advanced playmaker as well, because they don't shoot often, they don't cross often as well, and that's what we're looking for. So we've got one on either side. Having two Rodemonteurs might be a bit too adventurous, and so we've got a wing back on attack in Janmat to complement him. We do want crosses from byline, and he's the only player in our squad that will be doing that. We've also got an inverted wing back because they cross less often, and it complements the Rodemonteur there as well. So just bear in mind that your left flank might be a little bit weak, a hint weaker. If the Rodemonteur is doing his serious damage, you should be safe, but both will be cutting in, and so having an anchorman and Kapue will be very important, because you shouldn't worry too much defensively, because you've got a three-man midfield and they should cover the rest of your squad. You have a strong team shape, which is what the Rodemonteur asks for, it says here. Where does it say that? Yeah, result in quiet periods during which the Rodemonteur may neglect his defensive duties. Therefore, adequate cover and strong team shape are key. So just keep that in mind. If you feel like it's a bit too much, you can definitely go with a wing back on support, or even full back on support. Actually, just go with the wing back on support. You don't want crosses from deep. Complete wing back is a bit too expressive, I suppose, dribbling more and roaming and all that sort of business. So just go with a wing back on support, or an inverted wing back. I just picked the inverted wing back because they don't cross often, which is what we're trying to avoid in terms of trying to keep possession. You do eventually want to have just two regular standard central defenders. I feel like when you play on defensive centre backs, they do have more direct passes, and we're trying to avoid that. You can get away with it, like we mentioned in the first tactic, but just try and eventually build towards two regular central defenders. Goalkeeper will just be a standard goalkeeper. We've got Mesler on attack to support the false nine as well. And you can definitely go with the role of a central midfielder on attack too. I think that will do the job just fine as well. But yeah, a box-to-box midfielder seems to make the most sense. Someone who goes up and down and helps Kapue. You can definitely go with the Carrillo, I think, as well. They're used to, as it says in the description, that they can play as in part of a midfield three. But I just like the box-to-box midfielder role a little bit better. I feel like they do more defensively and more attackingly as well. You don't want the deep line playmaker on support, because they're still a bit too holding. An essential midfielder on support might do the job just well. You could definitely play an advanced playmaker on support, but the problem, because they don't shoot as much, they shoot less often in the instruction. But the problem is you'd be playing them on the same side as advanced playmaker Carrillo on the right wing, so it doesn't make sense. Ball winning midfielder on support, we're trying to avoid players who tackle harder, which is why we're trying to avoid a defensive forward on support as well. And so playing a ball winning midfielder might not make too much sense. Roaming playmaker dribbles more, so we don't want that. And I think that covers every role. So this is what I think you should eventually build towards. In terms of a 4-3-3 formation, you can definitely play other formations that keep possession, but just keeping in mind the 4-3-3, this is what you eventually want to build towards. Once Dini moves on, for example, if he gets too old, not good enough for the squad, that sort of business, then try and invest in the false nine. You can do Rodemonteurs and advanced playmakers. This is why we don't necessarily have a squad ready for first team action. So in terms of team instructions, we've gotten rid of work ball into box and dribble less, because these players do neither. They don't cross a lot and they don't dribble a lot either, and so you should be safer from that sort of business. And that's why we've removed the team instructions there. It's just kept it simple as shorter passing. So as you can see, huge changes. You're quite far away from actual possession football, but you should do the job as is right now with that team. And we've worked in the team instructions of work the ball into box and dribbling less to try and stop these players from doing what their roles actually tell them. I think if you feel like structured is holding you back a bit too much because you do have a hint more team instructions, you can try and go with fluid. But I feel like because you're a sort of weaker team in the league, then it might make more sense to try and keep a better team shape. But if you feel like structure is not working for you after, I don't know, like halfway through the season, for example, you can try and go for fluid and see if that suits your team a bit more. But yeah, like I mentioned, eventually try and build toward this tactic. So now, having covered that, we can talk about some other things here. Your staff can definitely do some improvement. I think you seem to be okay in some areas, but for example, your scouting system's an absolute mess. You could do a bit better with your physios, but in truth, your staff isn't as bad as some other teams. But really, your scouting system needs to be revamped entirely by the looks of it. Training, I just like to have it on high and balanced during preseason, and then average and balanced during the season itself. Match tactics during preseason, and then during the season, whatever my scout tells me. Schedule, you've got a decent set of friendlies here. An FM Cup as well, apparently, and they're okay, they're not too bad. But next season you want to try, if you do have the finances, go and tour, or even just host better friendlies at home, more competitive ones, and get some more gate receipts and whatnot. Competitions, expectation mid-table for Premier League. This one's just, I guess, no real expectations. Fifth round for the FA Cup, you enter in the third, you should be okay as a Premier League side, and the League Cup is the same. I feel like don't take the League Cup lightly. I always suggest this for the smaller teams, because if you do win the League Cup, you get Europa League football, and even if you end in, for example, if you for some reason get relegated, I don't think you should be a relegation team. But if you do get relegated, then you'll be a championship team in the Europa League, and that will still give you a bunch of money, which should help you jump right back into the Premier League and hopefully back into mid-table as well. Scouting system's been entirely revamped. You can change things around. If you ask me, any sort of Premier League team should have world packages for both senior and youth. It looks like Watford have this naturally. I didn't actually do this myself, so that's good to see. You can always give some more money to scouting budget. There's no harm there. The board itself have no restrictions, so you should be okay. In terms of the club, we talked about everything. I think you have decent facilities as well. Good, excellent. Data analysis isn't that important, but obviously try and build them up. Great youth facilities. And in terms of this, the stadium itself, you've got 21k. Once you do get more fans, then obviously try and expand on that. The board, though, 8 million in the bank. If you ask me, it's more like 5 million. I like to have it in the middle, leaning towards transfer budget. I feel like this is more realistic. You'll also have about 100k in wages to give. And with 5 million, you should hopefully bring in a decent left winger, which is your main area of concern. And obviously, if you sell off those excess numbers, we have 4 extra players than needed. You should have more money, if not more wages, to get your players that you needed in. Finances are in the red, which is a serious concern, but projection reads decently for you. You have a transfer budget of 43 million, 50 million and 58 in the next 3 seasons, which you can do serious damage with. The problem is that your balance isn't actually matching that, and so you might want to try and avoid using that money. So you might have 5 million, but you don't have any money in the bank, so try and possibly just bring in loan players instead. I think it's because Watford have spent a ton of money before you even arrived as well. You've got some debt here. I think he says 8.2 originally and just 6.93, so it's not a lot. You should be able to get rid of it soon enough, but it is really pulled out until 2020, 2019, 2022 is the furthest. And considering you just pay 236k per month, you should be able to be okay as well. Youngsters to look out for. We already talked about some players who are quite close to your first team, like Isaac's success, for example, inside forward. Doesn't naturally suit your team there. He doesn't seem to be okay with as a Rodomentor. Maybe try and play him as a striker instead. As an advanced forward, he might be able to do a job for you there instead. But yeah, we're not talking about who's close to first team football. We're more talking about the potential. In terms of potential, you do have a number of youngsters here, so I feel like anyone up until this point here, you should keep an eye on. The false 9 here, Michael as well, will suit your newer tactic eventually. Winger doesn't suit you, but fullback you might need as well. That's kind of it, but you do have some players to look out for. Some of these might actually exceed expectations, some might fall far short, and that's why you should also keep in mind that some of these players might do the same. And so just give every youngster as much importance as possible and see who becomes ready for first team football and who doesn't. But it looks like you've got some decent players there, enough to hopefully bring into your squad at least one within the next three years. So that's kind of it. I feel like we covered everything. So if you did enjoy today's episode, then of course please do hit the like button and subscribe for more daily Football Manager 2018 content. And as always, guys, thank you all very much for watching.